Greetings and welcome to episode 15 of DWP 2022. Our theme this season is Whoever Controls Africa Runs This World. And today's topic is basically the epistemology, African style meets quantum mechanics. So this is the untapped fountain of deep knowledge creation. So what have we covered so far as background? We have already been hammering the point home that whoever controls Africa runs this world, especially its resources. But we also know that Africa will definitely be the next economic superpower after US and China, especially the facts and analysis we've given to show that Africa is by far the largest resources of any continent, still distant second, third. And Africa just needs to increase its industrial output from currently 1%, 1.5% of global output to say 4 or 5%. And automatically, if that is undergirded by a small family farm agricultural revolution, we are going to have economic growth rates, absolute minimum 6% for several decades. That then means that by the middle of the century, Africa will be the largest economy. It's as simple as that. We concluded in the last session, as we started going into the real aspects of African philosophies and how they are important, not only in the unification of Africa, but also in preparing for Africa as the next super economic power. We said and agreed that industrialization and economic transformation is not a mechanical process. It is actually the transformation of a culture. It's a journey of cultural re-engineering. It's not, it's not a mechanical process. So it is important, therefore, that Africa does not sleepwalk into economic growth, but rather understand that as that growth happens, every aspect of society will transform. And if we're not careful, all the good elements in African culture, such as family, such as environmental sustainability, humanness, etc., will all disappear. And that's why identity as cultural intelligence has been the key topic over the last couple of sessions. Because identity is a large chunk of cultural intelligence. Why? Because it determines most of the important aspects of one's day-to-day life. In fact, lives of entire communities and people. It determines survival, self-reliance, self-discovery, how one creates, how one co-creates with others, even others who may not be of your own worldview. Coexistence, how we in this world continue to live across the diversity as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So we therefore concluded that we're not going to bother about highly academic definitions of identity and agreed that it is our approach to cultural intelligence that's important. And we just basically agreed that we will approach identity as cultural intelligence in terms of ways of life, is guided by shared worldviews and belief systems, in our case by Africans. And that is why we are taking also a more essentialistic approach to the issue of identity and knowledge generation. Remember, we touched on the fact that the public out there and the literature out there largely distinguishes between those who think it's very practical and important or essential that Africans work on their collective identity as the ticket towards emancipation and freedom of African peoples. There are others who are the non-essentialists who basically say there's no identity, there's nothing to worry about, we just live. There's too much diversity to even worry about it. So as you can tell, I lean towards more the essentialist, but I try very hard to present materials that I have to you so that you see both views, and it's all about debating and analyzing. It's not always about sticking to one position or gaining upper hand of a position. So what are the facts around African epistemology as it meets the newest form of science, that is quantum mechanics? The first fact I'd like to cover today is that Africans must know that in contemporary times, African life has been bankrupted of its original epistemological foundations. So I'm a lay philosopher, so I think I need to explain a little bit what we mean by epistemology. It just basically means approach to knowledge, approach to how we view knowledge and how it's developed and used. So it's a theory of knowledge. Some also call it cognitive science. So in terms of the elements that we want to emphasize today in terms of epistemology, we want to go deeper into elements which gets us to the nature of and origins and scope of how Africans have viewed knowledge, how they develop knowledge, how they approach the whole aspect of learning and knowing. And epistemology provides analytical tools to look at what rationality of belief is used and so on and so forth. Epistemology is just one sub-field of philosophy along with other major fields such as ethics, logic, and metaphysics. And in the next session, we'll actually spend quite a bit of time on metaphysics because it's a key element of African epistemology. So just to also provide you with a little bit more of the tools that are used in epistemology, usually it's all about discussions and analysis and rational disputation around four key aspects of knowledge. First, the philosophical analysis of the nature of knowledge and the conditions required for a belief to constitute knowledge. When is a belief agreed is knowledge? And what is truth? And how is truth justified in a worldview? What are the potential sources of knowledge that justify beliefs? How do you use perception? How do you reason? How do you use memory and testimony? So the other area where there's usually dispute is around the structure and body of knowledge itself, including whether all justifications of a belief system are derived from legitimate sources. And if there are foundations to such belief systems, how do we justify those foundations, and whether that may also require further interrogation. And then lastly is aspects of skepticism, which are important in all knowledge work and generation, because there's no absolute truth on anything in life. And this is why we are having this conversation today when we say African epistemology and it coming across quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics is what has now made it absolutely clear. There's absolutely no absolute truth on anything in life, especially in science, as we are now going to be arguing. So in conclusion, what we are on about is how Africans have been unceremoniously pushed and booted out of the sphere of understanding knowledge and how it's used, how we as Africans ask for ourselves the questions we have always asked pre-colonial. What do we know? How do we know it? What does it mean to say that I actually know something? What justifies that belief? And how do we know that we know? All those are deep questions that Africans used to debate amongst themselves, and our deepest thinkers basically went much deeper than is acknowledged. The second fact, I'll just go through by quoting one of the world's leading astrophysicists, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who basically says that intellectual centers of deep knowledge shift all the time. They shifted from the Nubians in Africa originally to the Egyptians, went through to Athens, went through to Rome, it was Europe, and so on and so forth, in terms of scientific knowledge and or European styles of philosophy, Plato, Socrates, and so on. But culture and religion both have immense power over epistemology. And when it comes to this acknowledgement that centers of knowledge generation shift, mainly because once there's too much putting knowledge in a box, when there's too much rigidity in how the beliefs are generated, ultimately any form of knowledge generation, including science, become irrelevant. So my own conclusion is that Western science, especially the more deterministic forms of Newtonian science, those were unfortunately actually used as tools for African epistemological genocide. As the colonizers came through, they used Newtonian sciences to push determinism and absolutism and say African systems of thinking and knowing are completely primitive. But we know today that many opportunities were missed because of that, and that the combination of pushing Newtonian science on the colonized and then at the same time forcing Middle Eastern religion on them, whether it is Islam or Christianity. Doing both at the same time means that you're not only killing African epistemology, you're also doing another thing. That is, you are saying African epistemology can only be used for bad outcomes, witchcraft, etc. Only Western epistemology can be used for good. But we know that all epistemologies in the world are used for both good and bad. And that's why today I can argue with you that by demonizing African epistemology, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, when you push people down into the caves, then they can't openly think, they can't openly say what the belief systems are, and they can't openly use them for learning, they eventually end up in some kind of secret societies. And that is how even today, what the remnants of African knowledge systems have been kept in what are basically equivalent to secret societies, who by virtue of the very closed-minded Western science and religions have had to survive by hook and crook. So this is basically the second fact. The third fact I want to cover is that African epistemology was pre-colonially way ahead of its time. And today, since Einstein in his last days was the first to open the doors for quantum physics, quantum mechanics, we're beginning to then slowly realize that this most advanced form of science, subatomic physics, is coming face to face with a really more complex universe than what we were made to believe by Newtonian science. So that the colonizing Europeans, when they came to Africa were threatened by the African worldviews. But today, some of those worldviews and belief systems are now being borne out by findings of quantum mechanics. Africans had much deeper insights and intuitions into the relationships between the physical world and the spiritual world. And that all of a sudden it's becoming clearer that day by day that African philosophy was strong and a story of wonderful, courageous, actually resilient and high-spirited people. That's really who Africans are. But because of the bigotry and prejudice of the colonial European mind, then riddled it with discrimination, intolerance, and actually bad faith. But Africans had much deeper insights into the relationships between the physical and the non-physical world. And we're much, much closer to the workings of nature. More importantly, actually, was the African approach to life in terms of thinking and knowledge generation. And I think this is what the future world needs. The fifth industrial revolution will be probably based on African epistemology, where it meets quantum mechanics. Fact number 4 is that the original African worldview does have some key elements which align it with quantum mechanics. Now, for a lay person, or from a lay person's point of view, even among scientists actually, there is growing consensus that the historically Western approach, which is more deterministic, more kind of analytical approach to not just science learning, but to logic, now has to be pretty much distinguished from the more probabilistic and more intuitive nature of subatomic article behavior and quantum mechanics. And that aligns much more with Afrocentric approach to understanding life processes. But in the literature, I was shocked to find that even today, philosophers, including African philosophers, who look at this as there's a subfield they call ethnophilosophy. So in the world, what has happened is if you don't think the same way as Western science has taught us and religions, then it then becomes ethnophilosophy. There's only one philosophy, that is European philosophy. Everything else is ethnophilosophy, including in universities. That has to change, and universities should teach African philosophy as African philosophy. The fundamental difference between the two is this: Africans reflect on the whole of reality. They don't just reflect on bits and pieces. They don't slice up reality and then say, now that I've understood parts of it, I just have to add the parts together, then I have total reality. No, Africans reflect on the totality of the reality, and they will consistently and continuously apply principles of uncertainty and probability, because there is no absolute truth on anything in life. It doesn't matter what it is. Fact number 5 is about the method, the traditional methodology of African knowledge seekers. How did they seek knowledge before the colonial disruption? I am quoting here a paper by Uti Egbai, University of Calabar. He done a fantastic paper on a comparative study of modern physics and African science. And here are his findings. You see, the Western scientists have always regarded the kind of African forms of reasoning as weak. They actually attribute the weakness mostly to what they think is bias. Okay, so in science, the preoccupation is we remove all bias from research, from experiments, from observation, from measurement. And Unfortunately, for science, quantum mechanics, and this is what Uti is basically saying, there's absolutely no way you can measure subatomic phenomena without interfering with it. So there's no science that's bias-free. Now we find out. So there's the difference is that in the traditional form of learning and knowing by Africans, they actually immersed themselves totally into the subject. So they were participating as they were learning, whereas scientists, Western style, want to assume that I'm not part of it, I'm not interfering, all I'm doing is I'm experimenting and I'm measuring. Well, quantum physics has come out clear as a bell. Absolutely no way. You can experiment, measure anything without interfering with it. Because even by paying attention to anything, you're already altering the behavior of the electrons and other subatomic particles. There's another paper I would like to also bring in on this one, because the methodology aspect is the key element. And this paper is by Ujuhoman and Akpan, actually, in an article entitled A Philosophical Appraisal of the Method of African Science. Another brilliant paper. And they actually they focus on the emphasis in African ways of learning and knowing. One, observation, and systemizing the observation, testing things, and confirming facts within the environment that they live in. So the key thing is, as Africans have had this close relationship with nature, so that they are deeply immersed in understanding it, is because the understanding has the underlying objective that Africans as humans have always wanted to understand how to live best within that environment, so that we're not just finding ways of controlling elements of the environment, but you're doing so in a way that says, I'm part of that environment, but being able to manipulate forces of nature to the advantage of the humans. Because let's face it, life is all about escaping these heavy consequences of uncertainties and not knowing what's going to happen next. So life is an attempt to harness enough understanding and knowledge of all these phenomena so that we can actually live off all these resources that the universe has provided us, or God has provided us. There's also another paper on methodology. This one is by Imani Nikita, on the paper, The Implications of Africa-Centered Conceptions of Time and Space for Quantitative Theorizing. So once again, this paper confirms that Eurocentric conceptions tend to emphasize linearity, disjunction, and discontinuity, whereas African conceptions tend to emphasize dynamism or secularity, holism, and continuity. So those are the facts I want to put on the table in terms of African epistemology and where it meets quantum mechanics. And please be back as we now analyze what this means for Africa and its identity and cultural intelligence. Thank you very much. We are talking today about African epistemology and where it meets quantum mechanics. So in the analysis, I actually would like to start on the premise that Africans historically, instinctively and intuitively understood that there is really no separation between the physical world and the spiritual world. And this worldview of Africans, no real distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world, is what we need as Africans today to go back, if we are to break the intellectual chains that were wrapped around our brains by the colonial experience. So the natural intelligence of Africans starts right there in realigning our understanding of the energies that constitute this world, this universe, that constitutes the entire human experience. So do a Sankofa, look back as far as we can look to understand, to see and understand how Africans in the past not only learned and thought, how they approached nature, how they immersed themselves in that process of learning about nature without pretending that they are an uninterested scientist who just is there to break things into various parts. And secondly, that therefore, understanding the whole for Africans is still more important to go back to than just understanding parts of the whole. But going back to, in fact, when I say do a Sankofa, you don't even have to go very far. Of course, I personally try to go as far back as I can to pre-colonial. But you don't, I just need to go back a decade or two, or even situation as it at the moment. And let me give you a couple of personal examples. One, take the issue of psychic visioning. As a young person, I grew up in this Eurocentric type of belief system pushed on me in school, at church, which basically said, oh, the Africans who either do psychic visioning or actually believe in it are witches and are evil. Okay. Then in my 20s, in my first visit to the United States, I find that by the 80s, they not only understood psychic visioning, they were actually beginning to recognize it as an important aspect of life. I still remember watching public television in the US as a young professional. On public television, watching an episode on psychic visioning, talking to parents how even to recognize psychic visioning capacity in young children and to be able to nurture it and support it. And there I'm thinking, what the hell? Nobody in Africa told us psychic visioning was not evil but natural. They spent decades chopping people's heads if they did not stop believing in psychic visioning because you were considered evil or a witch. I mean, people's heads were chopped even until recently. Even today in Africa, there are many Africans who won't even talk about it, and yet now it's considered a scientifically valid proposition. The second one is teleportation. Now, I use teleportation because I grew up hearing many stories about how people will just travel from here to and basically emerge 50 kilometers away or 100 kilometers away, and there you are. That's teleportation. But I was never able to physically prove that this is possible. I've just listened to people who have explained to me that it happens. But you know, now as a scientist, I came to the conclusion that actually it's not important for me individually to actually be able to scientifically prove that teleportation is possible. What's more important is that, can you imagine that before colonization, Africans already believed in teleportation. So whether they actually physically managed to do it or they physically actually do it is not the point. The point is that the people, their understanding of the of the universe, their understanding of the cosmic energies and how they apply, already knew that teleportation is a possibility. So just one of many, many other possibilities that are considered miracle, but they are just part of this universe. A third and final one is also a personal one, because in the more recently, in the 1990s to 2000, I started not only using and enjoying herbal medicines just to supplement my food and trying to see if I could be a healthier person without using artificial drugs and too many chemicals in my body. And once again, I had abomination, not only from friends and others, even from family. It's evil. How do you use African herbs? That's evil. Now, Zumbani, which is the top of the notch herb in Zimbabwe that saved millions in Zimbabwe from COVID-19. I mean, today, I did a rough back of the envelope assessment, and I would say that maybe 80% of the people using Zumbani today is a regular beverage, which brings them a better health and fight not only viruses, but Zumbani has elements in it which are also antifungal, antispasmodial. It fights bacteria, and so a magical herb. So there you are. After more than 100 years of being told by Christians that it's evil to use Zumbani, now Christians are using it to be able to fight a basic a new virus called COVID-19. So there are thousands upon thousands of other examples across the African continent. And needless for me to say that it's an area that Africans have to go deep into. Also in the analysis, I've come to the conclusion that there must be thousands upon thousands, millions even, of potentially different ways of thinking, of looking at the world. But most importantly, different epistemologies, ways of actually trying to learn, research, and understand this universe. So there are millions of possibilities, millions, billions. There's no need for universal truth on anything as long as people deeply understand all the possibilities that the universe offers. So for Africans, there's a lot of room for rediscovering ourselves, reasserting and redefining the world for ourselves, and also redefining again the real meaning of life and how we immerse ourselves in our lives. And also there's a lot of room as I analyze the situation that we are too restricted to the Western scientific approaches. The methodologies are limited. There is need to sharpen those African methodological approaches, especially and we can even mix with some of the Western tools. But immersion in nature is one that I think we have missed the most. There's so much knowledge that has been lost because most of it was through immersion in nature. And any ordinary African adult would have that knowledge and pass it on to generations. And now that has been cut. We don't even know these trees, the herbs anymore. We don't know the different birds and animals and how to learn from them for our own benefit. So I think we need to find ways of going back to those immersion scientific approaches so that we can surface deeper understanding and use of especially metaphysical energy that's out there in the advancement of human enlightenment. So all probabilities are always on is, I think, the fundamental conclusion in my analysis. All possibilities in the universe are always on. And And the epistemology has to accept that, and therefore can't limit too much the tools and approaches that are applied in understanding life. So on the basis of that, I could therefore also say that maybe all problems we have in life are just an absence of higher thought, and not the presence of evil, by the way, but just refusing to elevate the thinking and epistemological game. When I analyze the future of Africa in its industrialization, this has huge implications, because going into an industrial society without revising and revisiting African epistemology and dilute some of the Newtonian approaches a lot more and align better with quantum mechanics, then that way industrialization of Africa will be less of a mechanical process and more of cultural intelligence, interpreting and re-engineering society. The last element I would like to cover in the analysis is actually this whole element of holism, because the most valuable element for me in African epistemology is the holism, is the ability and approach to reflect on the entirety of reality, and be able to go beyond understanding of individual parts, and then trying to add those up back, which I think is the Western deterministic approach. We know that some of the individual parts were always far smaller than actually the whole when it is put together. So reality as a whole is the perspective that I think we should push hard, as opposed to individual parts. And as I push holism, I also then push the immersion again and say, let's not restrict ourselves to approaches which distance ourselves from the subject we are studying. Because once again, it eventually has to boil down to the basics of how it impacts on the human experience. So the idea that we will find out the impact of human experience when we test out drugs, when we figure, you use guinea pigs and so on, is not always the only approach that we could take. And the key findings to date in quantum mechanics is in terms of elemental energy that is now agreed is all there in different forms of subatomic particles. It's practically the same stuff that Africans recognized everywhere as spirits. So spirits in the trees, in the rivers, in the mountains, in the animals, in the stones. In short, nature was all an amalgamation of these worldly spirits. So I would say that in conclusion then, and in terms of the analysis, that the African epistemology is therefore ultimately an admixture of what it takes to get to human experience and realities by acknowledging the existence of both spiritual world and physical world in the same place, and that learning and understanding and knowledge generation is all ultimately intended to improve human existence. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back shortly with the conclusion. Thank you. Welcome back to conclusions on this topic. African epistemology meets quantum mechanics. So, as I said, there are millions of, in fact, billions of possibilities of existence, and also of ways of learning and understanding that existence. So there's absolutely no need for universal truth on anything. For Africa, therefore, in conclusion, as we prepare to shift from a predominantly kind of agrarian rural society to one which is more urban industrial, as we make that shift and become the world's largest economy, we run the risk of continuing to use Western-style epistemology to define an industrialization process, which really has to be informed by African philosophy and African values. That is why human software and mindset is more important in industrialization than the hardware. As I say, industrializing Africa should not be a mechanical process. We should first dig deeper into this African epistemology and cultural intelligence to inform how society can then go more urban industrial whilst retaining the humanness and humanity and the strong family system and the understanding of this relationship between the spiritual world and the physical world. So I'm saying, as Africa advances to the next super economic power, we should not just be able to land people on Mars, but we should be able first to have technologies that stop mass murder of people on the streets. I mean, how do you have kids going with a machine gun in a school, mow down people, and all these types of human misadventures on a world or in a world that sends people to Mars? No. So African cultural intelligence should see Africa as the most advanced economy with the capability of producing much more enlightened technologies. So if Africa is going to be strong and united, resilient, and influential globally, it can, in my conclusion, only be based on understanding our identity and have intensifying cultural intelligence. And that's why today I thought talking about African epistemology, where it meets quantum mechanics, as the one element that really informs our journey towards identity and cultural intelligence. So cultural intelligence has to be a continuous crafting of our way of life that is guided by our worldviews and belief systems, which are anchored around humanness and oneness of the human race on one hand, but based on the underlying African worldview, which basically says, I think, everything is one. I mean, things may all look different, but ultimately it looks like it's the same thing. You know, times change, things change over time, major jumps in technological changes and so on. But when you look carefully, you do a proper sankofa behind and forward, it's more or less the same thing repeating itself. So it's important, therefore, in my conclusion, to emphasize that I brought this topic around African epistemology, where it meets quantum physics, as an add-on to the whole issue of identity and cultural intelligence, because we Africans, we've been pushed to the bottom of the heap through slavery and colonialism, and yet we know that's not the problem. We're here to create new history. We will be the largest economy in the world. We will be the largest number of people in the world. By the middle of the century, 1 in every 5 human beings will be African. So our African identity is critical. Today, if we're going to move that journey without further destabilization by by forces who don't really believe we should improve. Identity and cultural intelligence impact on all our lives as a people. The survival strategies, the creative energies, the whole aspect of self-reliance, how we create and co-create with others and other nations, how we exist and coexist with others, all boils down to identity and cultural intelligence. So the answers lie right here in Africa. We can learn and borrow from others, but it has to be intelligent borrowing, not copying and pasting. But truths that we discover ourselves using our own worldviews, using our own learning and knowing methodologies are the ones that are the most valuable, that will bring out the uniqueness of Africa in this diverse world. And on that basis, I would say thank you very much for listening. We'll be back in the next episode and talk about metaphysics this time. We are going to look at African epistemology again, but where it meets metaphysics. Don't miss that one. See you in the next episode. Thank you. Bye. So my name is Mandi Rukuni. I authored this book, Being African, which I'm recommending to you. You stand a chance of winning a copy of this book in the DWP competitions. But I wrote this book primarily because we Africans often confuse Westernization with modernization. So this book goes through what it takes for us to modernize Africa using our heritage rather than Westernizing it. So Hunu, Botu, Ubuntu, Udugu is what this book is about. I recommend it to you highly, and those who want the practical side of how to succeed using heritage values, you can go to the small handbook of African Pathways to Success. Look forward to you participating in the competition. Thank you.
Stand a chance to win a copy of the book, Being African, or the booklet, African Pathways to Success, by subscribing to our YouTube channel, Dialogue with Prof Mandi Rukuni, and leaving a comment on one of our recent videos. You can also like our Facebook page and comment on a recent post. If you're on Instagram, follow the profile Prof Mandi Rukuni and leave a comment on a recent post as well. A random participant will be chosen at the end of the month and will be contacted and given the book.